Well, hello, welcome to the first edition of Election Science Office Hours in 2026. It's kind of amazing to think it's now 2026. We're so glad to have you here with us today. Election Science Office Hours is a webinar and podcast that's hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech, known as LCSSP, and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. You can find our archive of over 2 dozen episodes. Gosh, we're getting closer to three at this point, 3 dozen. Available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and they're also on our Caltech Election Integrity Project page on our project website at protectingtheelection.us, which is super easy to remember. Please make sure to follow us on social media. We've got a very active presence on LinkedIn, X, Blue Sky, even now on Instagram and Facebook, which is totally cool, where you can catch all the latest updates on our work and where we'll be posting information about upcoming episodes. We are going to be continuing to do these, every other week throughout 2026, because this is going to be a very interesting and we'll see exciting election coming up. Let's see. So make sure that if you have any questions, down at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, there's a little Q&A button. You can click that button and you can post your questions there. And, I'll try to pay attention to that and we'll do our best to try to answer those questions as quickly as we can. So today, this is a lot of fun because our guest, or I think she really is a co-host here and really close colleague, is my colleague, friend, and frequent collaborator, Caltech alumni, LCSSP research affiliate, and co-organizer for these two fantastic conferences that we're going to talk about today, Betsy Sinclair. Betsy is the Thomas F. Eagleton University Professor of Public Affairs and Political Science, Chair of the Political Science Department, and Assistant Vice Provost of Digital Transformations at Washington University in St. Louis, which we'll probably call today WashU. This is Betsy's second time on Election Science Office Hours. So if you want to know more about Betsy's background and research interests, please check out the May 2025 episode in our archive. Today, Betsy's joining us for a conversation that's titled Inside the 2025 Caltech Election Integrity Project Conferences, Research, Risks, and Real-World Implications. And for those of you who've been on with us before or watched online before, unlike these typical office hours episodes where I kind of grill the guests with lots of questions, which in my very professorial way, I'm really good at. Betsy and I are going to just basically ask each other questions about the two conferences and our research project that we're working on, and really have a conversation. So let's get right to it, Betsy. Welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike, and thanks everyone for being here. When I look back on 2025, I actually think it's pretty remarkable that we had not one but two major conferences. It's just like a crazy thing to think about. Like, what did we do last year?
Right.
Our holiday cards could have said two major conferences. And we did other things. So we were busy doing teaching classes and conducting research and mentoring students. You're running this center. I'm running a department. And I think the first thing I want to say is just thank you to everyone who helped us do this. Whether it's the Caltech team, the WashU team, the team that was supporting us across both of these campuses, it's really an incredible amount of people who made this possible. So I think the first thing to say, without naming anyone specifically, is just to say thank you. We saw a lot of teamwork come in to doing things like creating graphics or name tent cards or managing, Zoom meetings, developing agendas, recruiting panels of experts, and stuff that ranges, in some ways that's sort of pedestrian, like really hard stuff, like arranging hotel rooms for all those out-of-town guests, and all of the social media stuff that's happened. So I just think we should start off by saying, like, when I look back on 2025, and I think you and I organized two major conferences, the reality is that a team of people organized two major conferences, and we got to be part of that team. And one of the things that I think is really important to note here is why. and why these election science office hours have been so important to have. And it's because people really care about free and fair elections. And so we see teams from all over the place just coming together to say, how can we help? How can we make this happen? I think you probably want to also just say thank you to the people who supported us.
Yeah, and it's amazing to think too that these teams that we've put together, folks who are working with us behind the scenes, did this twice last year. Um, and we actually moved our first event in January of last year at this very time in January of last year from being an in-person conference to a virtual conference with literally less than a week's notice because of the tragic wildfires that affected us here in Pasadena and in the greater Los Angeles area. Um, and so, I also wanted to just thank, all the folks who are out in the general election science space, the research colleagues who we have, state and local election officials who've been collaborating with us on these conferences on projects, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission commissioners and their staff, the folks from industry and the election technology area. And again, just this broader group of community stakeholders who came together and helped us organize both these conferences and help participate and help get the word out about what we were doing in these conferences and about their perspectives on some of the issues that we raised. I also want to just make sure that we thank all the folks who actually provided the financial support because these things they're not cheap, as you can imagine. Even trying to do it virtually was not a cheap enterprise. And our our funders include the Wiedenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy, Frick Institute, the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy at Caltech, and the Haynes Foundation, who has in part funded these efforts as part of this Caltech Election Integrity Project.
I think that as we think about all of those funders and all of these people who've helped us, a theme is going to emerge as we talk about these meetings, which is going to be like disaster preparedness. And so these two conferences, they happened. The first we had to move virtually because of the wildfires in Southern California. And the second actually happened in the middle of the government shutdown.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually had a number of staffing pivots or attendee pivots because we all of a sudden had a set of federal officials who were not able to participate in our meeting. And so I think that's going to be something I know I'm going to want to talk about in this conversation. But Mike, when you think about like all of the things that happened, let's go back to January, January of 2025. What were your biggest takeaways from that conference?
Well, it's actually kind of been fun and sort of scary to prepare for this because as I went back and started to reflect a little bit and watch the videos, right? So those of you who are watching this, like every single session, all of the videos from both these conferences are available online, so you can go back and watch all this that we're talking about. I went back and looked at those sessions, and it's important to reflect that we had that conference in January right before the second Trump administration took office, right after the 2024 election, had really just kind of wrapped up and things were very fresh in our minds and in the minds of the research community and election officials about the 2024 election. So like the immediate reaction to it is like, God, that seems like a billion years ago, right? Because so much has happened in the last 12 months. But some of the things that we talked about at that conference were really, I think, informative and I think very, very exciting. And we talked a lot at that conference about the 2024 election and what was learned, both in terms of the campaigns and the conduct of the campaigns, the politics of the elections, and kind of the information ecosystem that existed. We also talked about the reverse side of that, which is the ecosystem of rumors and misinformation and how that affected not just voters and voting behavior, but also affected the workflow of our colleagues in the elections field. So as I was looking back, I was thinking quite a bit about really the 2024 election and kind of what we knew at that point, and some of the additional things that we've learned since then. I think though the one thing that really jumps out at me though as I look back at that conference was that the 2024 election was one where obviously we all had tons of concerns about the conduct of the election. I mean, we're always worried about making sure that these elections, these presidential elections in particular, that they're conducted in a free and fair manner, that there aren't, serious allegations of fraud. There aren't the sort of meltdowns that we saw back in the 2000 election, which is that's actually Betsy and I's origin story, right? Is all around the 2000 election. And none of that happened in 2024. And I think that again, the takeaway from that, and we talked a little bit about this in 2024 at the conference, is that despite all of the concerns and worries that we had going into that election in November 2024, things worked pretty well, despite the conflicts, the controversy, the rancor, the misinformation, all of the things that were happening. And I think that really just is a strong testimony to the hard work that went into that election, ranging from the work that was done by the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, the folks who were in CISA at Homeland Security at that point in time, to state and local election officials who were working tirelessly to make sure that that election worked without any serious hitches. And also the work that we were doing on all the research community who was really kind of banding together and trying to help election officials out. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, it just struck me like how well the 2024 election went. But importantly, what that means for how much work needs to go into making sure that important elections like we're about to have at the end of this year, how much work needs to go in to make sure that they happen in a flawless manner. Well, what about you though? What did you take away from that conference, and then more importantly, the January 2025 or no, excuse me, the more recent conference that we had?
So, I think some of what you said really echoes with me. So, ahead of the November 24 election, I was really worried about what was going to happen. Mostly, I was really worried about where public opinion was going to be in terms of trust in democracy, trust in public institutions. I thought if we had a really close election, we could end up with some really hard things happening in our country, whether or not that could be protests or it could be, really undermining the legitimacy of democracy. And we didn't see those things. So when we had this conference in January of 2025, the leading takeaways were conversations about affordability and understanding voter motivations and the price of eggs. And what's amazing to me is, a year later, we're still having conversations about affordability and the price of eggs. But we're also still, I think, in this space where we're having conversations about concerns about making sure that we're doing the preparations necessary to be able to run elections in November of 2026. And one of the things that I think was really assuring in that January meeting, which we didn't hear in the second meeting, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, was just the volume of preparation that was happening behind the scenes across counties and the infrastructure that we had in place to support counties. And just how much of that is absolutely necessary. And we're going to still need that today. I think we see that level of concern. So the thing that surprised me the most, just to locate the audience in terms of going back in time. So in January, there are these terrible wildfires that have swept through Southern California, and we're forced to move the conference online. And the Caltech and WashU teams spring to action, and they figure out how to do that. And when we had been originally planning this meeting, we were planning a relatively small meeting. This election science is a sort of niche area in political science. And so we thought, well, there'll be lots of findings that are maybe of interest, so we can generalize these findings to people who are interested in political behavior or are interested in political institutions. But there's only a small community that's really interested in election science, so we'll have a small meeting. And then we moved it online. And all of a sudden, there was this surge of interest. I mean, we had over 300 people show up for this meeting online. And that's just a really remarkable thing. People who had 1 week notice and all of a sudden decided that they wanted to spend their time with us. And I think the reason they wanted to spend their time with us is because of just how important the field sees this as now a really critical thing to study and to understand. But it's also the case that there's this broader practitioner community that's extremely hungry for research. And so to understand where we are in terms of the national politics of higher education, there's actually tremendous hunger for understanding the research that's happening right now. And that ability to do translational work, to be able to say, here are the research findings, and here's how you can use these research findings in your day-to-day operation of your county election office is actually something that gives me like tremendous hope for what it is that we're doing as universities and as researchers. So, one of the things that happened in this January meeting was we had people from all kinds of different communities join. So we had people who are county election officials come. We had people who are vendors. We had journalists come. We had people who are researchers who are more tangentially related, people who are researchers who are central, and this emerging younger cohort of researchers who are in graduate school who came and wanted to be part of that conversation too. And I just thought, well, this is incredible. And so as I sat in that meeting and I got to present, sitting in my family room, because I didn't get to go to Caltech at that time, I thought, well, I'm missing out on the beautiful weather, although maybe it's still a bit smoky in Southern California at that point in time. But man, am I really given a lot of hope and encouragement by the volume of people who want to be part of this conversation right now. And we need to do it again.
Mhm.
One of the reasons we wanted to do it again was because we just saw there's a lot to talk about, and we actually couldn't cover all of the topics that we needed to cover in that first meeting. But the second thing to do it is that it's pretty clear that there are people coming from these different communities who don't know each other, and we need to learn how to trust each other. And that ability for how to trust each other and have conversations is a really going to be, I think, a recurring theme in terms of how we prepare for November 2026, is that we have to learn who to call when you're stuck. And as we've seen, the infrastructure at the federal level change to move away from what CISA looked like, in the last November election. We're going to need to try to think about where are those opportunities to build infrastructure and build institutions that we can trust and we can rely on. And what I'm hoping is this community starts to emerge, that this is the space that you can go to have some of those conversations. And so we had the second meeting. So we had the second meeting at WashU in October. It really helps to learn the people, to have a coffee or a beer and have an unscripted conversation and start to learn where people's values are. So I thought that takeaway was just like we really needed that moment to learn to trust each other. And I think we started working on that in that second community, that in-person thing. So we had a chance to come back together in October and learn to trust each other. And the things that I took away from that October meeting are, pretty varied in terms of topic. But one was just we're also seeing this huge transformation in terms of AI. So we need to talk a little bit about that today. It's just like, where are we in terms of the space of AI and AI threats? But the second was just, these questions about election security, they're often overlaid with a partisan lens. The
Mhm.
idea that there's partisan bias in this. And I think the main takeaway that I want to emphasize in today's conversation for what happened in that conversation is like, this is actually a place where we see tremendous bipartisan consensus that actually running free and fair elections and running elections with integrity and care is something that both parties are firmly committed to. And there's this understanding that this is actually like such an important thing to do that what we saw were, county election officials who are from both sides of the political spectrum came together and said, we have the same kinds of common concerns. We have same kinds of common questions. We could come together and say, wow, we can learn from each other. We can learn from these researchers. We can learn from some of the technology experts. We're actually getting a lot of information and high quality conversation from the journalists who come together. So it's that trust, but also this is a really bipartisan issue. And so we need institutions that are actually nonpartisan in these spaces to be able to give people space to come together and have that conversation. So I want to come back to these questions about AI because I think like the second meeting, it was this moment where we got to talk about AI. And so the main theme, I think, of that second conference had to do with AI and elections. Now, to flag for the webinar audience, one thing that's super important is that we are not talking about how ballots are counted here. That is a process that is distinct from this. Ballots are not counted with any kind of AI technology whatsoever. But there are opportunities for those technologies to lean in and help. And so I think one thing that came out of this meeting was just the intersection of how election officials have really high standards for using technology. And those standards are grounded in responsible use and extraordinary reliability. It's also the case that their needs are just enormous in terms of like their constituents are constantly reaching out to them and saying, hey, we need something. Hey, we need something. Um, So in the future, like, could you imagine something? Like, what is the tool that people need to work on now? Could it be a collaboration with an organization like NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, to benchmark something like the reliability of commercial chatbots that are could be RAG-based to provide election information?
We absolutely need, well, we need two things, right? I think one first off is a continued focus on collaboration between the research community and election officials and technologists to be building tools that are usable, useful, secure, transparent, all those kind of dimensions that we care about with respect to election technology that take AI and really deploy it in ways that help inform voters, right? That help provide them information that they need about how to get their ballot, right? How to return it, how to answer questions about what's on the ballot, and also to actively continue to prevent the spread of really problematic election falsehoods, deliberate attempts to misinform voters about about their voting opportunities, for example. So we need a process that really continues to build out that technology. That's some of the kind of work we've been doing, and we'll probably come back to that at some point. But we also need a partnership with someone, somewhere like NIST or maybe a consortium of universities like ours or something that helps take the technology and test it, right? And effectively certify it for use, or at least give some clear indication of its strengths and weaknesses. Because I really think that's one of the stumbling blocks right now for deployment of a lot of really kind of interesting AI technologies when it comes to election administration. Because I think one of the things that just like hit me right between the eyes in both these conferences is when you talk to our colleagues in the election space, they're incredibly cautious about deploying technologies in their workflows. And partly that's because they have to be. I mean, election administration is a really strange business in the sense that, the election occurs on it one day on the calendar, right? And you have a lead up to that day, and you cannot allow for mistakes or technological crashes, right? So you don't have a lot of opportunity to be testing things in the field. So what I think the election community really does need is, again, they need us to be developing the tools, but we need to be able to figure out who it is that's going to test and certify these tools so that election officials can feel confident deploying them in their workflows in the advance of a major election.
I would really like that to be, an actor in the scientific community. And I think that seems like, we've seen NIST already come in and make some, begin to establish some kind of standards within the space of AI. I think your idea of a university consortium is also a really interesting one because I think having a nonpartisan space here is going to be really important. Something that came out, I think, as another theme of that second meeting was just the enormous concerns that some people had regarding bad actors.
Mhm.
Or bad actors taking bad actions, I would say. And so we know that there are lots of instances where we're seeing deepfakes.
Mhm.
Where are we as a society or as an election community or maybe even as a research community? Um, in terms of being prepared for these kinds of deepfakes? And do you think we're underprepared for this kind of attack?
I do, and I said so at our conference at WashU. I think so again, when I look back at January on the January conference, we talked a lot about how rumors and deepfakes and misinformation, can affect voting behavior, can affect the conduct of elections, and it can affect the workflow and the work that election officials are doing, right? These attacks and threats and rumors and falsehoods have all sorts of deleterious effects throughout the election process. We heard a lot of research on that in January, right? And then, we heard some more research on that, in particular on defects, which we can talk a little bit in more detail about at the conference at WashU in October. Uh, but the one thing that I think we heard in October, which I found a little bit interesting and a little bit concerning, was kind of a theme from some in the elections community that kind of runs in the following way. which is, we did a lot of this preparation in 2024. There was a lot of concern about AI and AI's effects and bad actors using AI to negatively affect the 2024 election. We were really well prepared for that. And well, look, nothing happened, right? And I think the important lesson there is that we were well prepared and nothing seems to have happened. Not that as we go into 2026 and 2028, that we don't need the same level of preparation, right? And I think that we heard that from some, but we also at the same time, I think, heard from some that there needs to be an effort, and I don't really have a great sense for how we're going to do this quickly over the next couple of months, but to try to build, as you pointed out already, to rebuild some of that institutional structure that was in place in 2024. The absence of I think a very strong and concerted, federal engagement in cybersecurity and election security is a potential concern as we go into 2026. So, I'm always, and I've been around this area for, I don't know, 25 years now. And every election, I feel like I'm kind of one of the ones who's saying, oh my goodness, all these bad things can happen. And the great news is that they very rarely ever do, right? And that, again, I think that's a testimony to the work that goes in by the elections community to secure elections. But I'm a little bit worried right now that there's just a feeling of like, okay, well, nothing has happened so far, so what me worry.
I think you're right. I have the same concern. I think we heard a number of people saying like, oh, everything was okay, or, voters seem a little bit more robust than we thought when they're exposed to misinformation or disinformation or these deep fake videos. And there were another set of people who said like, but we haven't really seen it hit hard yet.
Hmm.
And so, it's like we saw slightly heavy rain, but we haven't seen the hurricane yet. So we actually don't know what we're dealing with. But as we think about like, okay, so what do we need to do to prepare in terms of debunking or pre-bunking or partnering? What are the strategies that we can use for counterattacks?
Well, I think there's a number, and I think this really does get into some of the work that you and I are currently doing with our colleagues, Mitchell Liniger and Sander van der Linden and a few other of our students. I think there's a multi-pronged approach that's necessary, right? I mean, first off, we need to understand how we can try to detect especially pernicious and problematic falsehoods that might be circulating, especially online, that might disenfranchise voters. I mean, what we need some sort of real-time detection ability, so that, once those rumors start to percolate or they start to be seeded by bad actors or by, folks with ill intention from, other governments that may oppose our government, that we can find those rumors and problematic falsehoods before they really start to take effect. I think that's one thing that the research community has worked a bit on, but I think we really do need a lot more work in that space. The second thing, though, is that when these falsehoods come to the surface, whether that's from a detection process or whether that's from an election official who just gets word of one or someone asks them about it, we need to really have a kind of two-phase strategy, right? One is that we need to develop immediate debunking. In other words, we need to develop immediate arguments as to why this particular rumor or deliberate falsehood is incorrect, and give that information to election officials, to other stakeholders, to journalists, again, others who are involved in elections, so that they can help get the word out to those who've already been exposed, right, to these problematic falsehoods. But then we need to take, I think, additional steps, which is that we need to again use the technology like AI to build effective mechanisms where we can expose people who have not seen these arguments to kind of soften versions of these arguments and let them know this is problematic information, so that they can then be able to recognize not just the specific type of falsehoods, but the structure and content and approach that is being used by folks to disseminate these kinds of falsehoods so that when they encounter them in the future, they're skeptical. So what we need to do is again, I think, use AI technologies to help educate folks how to be more skeptical about the information that they see online.
I think I know every time anyone hears the phrase once upon a time, you know what's going to happen next isn't real. Like you can immediately identify that genre. And one of the things that I find relatively encouraging in this space of a lot of this misinformation or disinformation is it has a genre associated to it, and people can learn to recognize that. And so that just seems like some kind of civic muscle that the American public needs to develop. And I think this is a place where research can actually provide tremendous value in helping many of these public officials learn how to help their constituents develop that kind of civic muscle to say, oh, if the story starts with once upon a time, it's probably not true.
Right. Right.
And learn how to identify that real early on. And it works. I mean, I think that one of the really remarkable components of the research that we've seen so far is that actually works and it sticks.
Yeah, we've been working on that in our research, and we talked quite a bit about some of these technologies at the conference, especially in October. But that one of the things that was, I think, very clear, in particular in October at WashU, is that election officials and election stakeholders, they're really excited about the technology, in particular AI and new technologies. One of the things you said earlier about the general level of excitement and enthusiasm for the January event that we had, that was also true in October, right? Because that we had many more people apply to attend. We had this incredible amount of interest in attending, and because it was an event that was held in person, we only had so many chairs, right? And so we could only invite a certain number of people, right? And we literally did have some people just standing because people showed up, and there was a huge amount of interest in it. I think the dilemma, though, that we saw, and I know this really struck you, and so I'm kind of curious to hear your reaction to it, is that while election officials and election stakeholders are really excited about AI, a lot of the applications that we heard them talk about AI and the work that they do in both conferences were really not terribly exciting. Why do you think we aren't hearing more from election officials about really exciting applications of really cutting edge AI technology in election administration?
I love this question because that is the thing that I came out with as the strongest signal from this meeting was like election officials just don't have the tools they need yet.
Mhm.
Um, and there's this sort of disparate response. So I think of like you can think of like three types of officials who were at our meeting. One set is very concerned about the rising sustainability concerns with respect to AI, the reliance on data centers, the concerns about rising electricity usage, and is just not so sure about the technology in general. So like
Mhm.
there are some AI skeptics out there. There are another set of election officials who have been like either they have been experienced or have been vulnerable to tremendous attacks, informational war attacks, and those election officials are sort of desperate for technology, and they are going to be our early adopters. One of my favorite moments at the meeting was someone who said, like, we actually need more robots to be engaged here. It's the human element that's providing so much, uncertainty into our space. And the third are these more conventional election officials who are really driven by caution.
Mhm.
It's an enormous amount of responsibility to run an election, and they are driven by caution. And so they are very concerned that they could contribute to the misinformation problem. So they want to do everything they can to manage the risk of hallucination. So a hallucination is when AI technology shares something that isn't true. And it's one that election officials are struggling with. So one of the things that we learned at this meeting was simply that like a lot of officials don't even have standardized office policies for how their workers can use this technology in developing work product. They're still trying to think through that. Um, some of them are sort of aware that that is something that they needed to develop, but they're definitely not having anything necessarily that's constituent facing so far. and that they recognize there's this tension that, of course, the human beings that they have that are constituent facing are going to sometimes make mistakes. And those human beings obviously sometimes have political biases. So obviously, it's not that their systems are infallible, they are sometimes imperfect. But they are also systems that have endured for decades, and they're ones that people trust. And so to change the system, they want to make sure that the new system is going to reduce the risk of hallucination, and specifically that like they're going to reduce the ways in which that any kind of informational error that's going to be introduced is going to be free of political bias.
Mhm.
And so these AI solutions, some of them are new that we don't actually have this certification process to report the rate at which they're going to produce error. And so I think there is this emerging research that exists. I mean, it's pretty exciting to try to think about measuring the political bias in these systems. Does Grok have more bias than ChatGPT? Like there are lots of interesting questions in that spaces. And when we heard about some of that at the conference, so I think like that was a really exciting space. I think a lot of the election officials were busy trying to like carefully consume that. We saw a number of questions from the EAC about like the extent to which those biases were present or not. And the questions about regulation in these spaces is also a really interesting question if that's something that we see emerging at the federal level. But the challenge for the research community, I think, is to try to do these comparisons, to try to compare the bias that exists in the human system versus the bias that's going to exist in this AI technology. And there's just need. So like,
Mhm.
the other thing that we saw is like people are a little bit stuck sometimes, so they recognize this might actually help. And so ahead of an election, um, county officials are bombarded with questions: where to cast a ballot, how to cast a ballot, am I eligible to cast a ballot, did I spoil my ballot, how do I drop it off, how do I, manage access, lots and lots and lots of questions. And right now they have human-facing systems answering and addressing a lot of those questions. And their phone lines are swamped. And so they're stuck sometimes. They don't want to necessarily rely extensively on web pages. Those are hard to navigate. They're not accessible to everyone. There are literacy concerns here in terms of being able to like click on which button and where things are located. So they know it's like would be great to figure out how to make that information more available to people. But the employees, hiring more employees is really expensive. There's just a
Mhm.
general sense that people want to use tax dollars really efficiently. And so this was like a really great problem that could be solved with technology. It's like, well, if we had, for example, a chatbot that could answer constituent questions in real time, that could be available 24/7, it could use the information that's available on our website, it could, help make it accessible. You could interrogate those kinds of questions. Would this work? Would be financially cheaper? Could it be done with AI? And we just haven't seen a lot of adopters in this space. So, we've seen LA County start to like deploy a little bit of this technology, but we aren't seeing a lot of county adoption. And I think this risk of hallucination is enormous. And so I think this is a really great moment for the research community to try to think about like how can we try to establish some additional benchmarks here to provide measurements that then the county election officials could say, hey, here are the measurements that we can now adopt this new technology with confidence to understand how to make sure we maintain the trust of our voters and also maximizing the reliability of the information they provide. I just think this is a really exciting space to like be in, but we just need the research to sort of catch up to provide the information to the county election officials so that they can deploy it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree 100%. Now, at these conferences, in particular the conference in October at WashU, some election stakeholders are trying to sound alarms about AI and how it can be weaponized, going kind of back to the question that we were talking about a little earlier. Former Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman, during her keynote conversation at the October conference, expressed a lot of these kinds of concerns. But again, we hear a lot of we were worried about that in 2024, nothing happened. I want to kind of go back to that and ask you, do you think that stakeholders and academics and election officials ought to be worried about the weaponization of AI in 2026 and 2028?
Yes, this is actually my primary concern for 2026 and 2028. Um, One of the things that I really love that CISA has done is to build these kind of tabletop games. And the tabletop games, they actually give a county a way to work through with their whole team a number of scenarios. So if disaster strikes, you're ready.
Mhm.
And if I could do one thing, it would be to build a new kind of tabletop game that would actually really focus on the weaponization of AI. Because I think there are a lot of threats here. And we don't have a way right now to be in this space and to provide a way to mitigate this risk for our county election officials. We don't have that, updated tabletop version of a game from CISA. So, the tabletop games we have right now, they're things like, what if a polling place is affected by a sudden storm? What if there's a flood? Or what if there's something even worse, like a terrorist attack? What do we do? And the team works through the scenario to say, suppose the worst thing you could possibly imagine happens. What do you do then to make sure your election is run free and fair? How can we still have free and fair elections? And you work through who you would call and what you would set up and what you would do. And you work through all of those scenarios. And as you work through them, you're like, okay, we're ready.
Mhm.
And I think at this point, as a country, we actually need a lot more planning to go through these kinds of informational wars. We know there are a host of international actors out there who do not want American elections to be free and fair. They want to intervene. And we also have seen, for anyone who's ever been affected by a scam, like that there are actually lots of people out there who are just up to mischief. Whether that's swatting, whether that's building a bot to create mischief, whether that's trying to, get someone's information from their bank account. I think we can see there are a whole set of people out there who actually are not designed with civics in mind.
Mhm.
And so trying to mitigate those seems really important. I also just think it's really hard for people to figure out what is true. Pew has consistently asked people, how hard is it for you to figure out what is true on the internet? And we consistently see a lot of Americans saying, I actually have a really hard time with that myself. Um, it's gotten with AI technology really easy to produce fiction. So
Mhm.
it's easy to produce a fake AI video. It's easy to produce a fake AI photograph. It's easy to produce fake AI text. It's easy to produce fiction. And truth has always been expensive, but the relative difference, the delta between truth and fiction has gotten enormous here. It's still really hard to do careful research to figure out what is true. It's still really hard to do careful journalism to figure out what is true. But fiction has gotten really cheap. And so now that difference is enormous. And that makes elections really hard because it's important that people have confidence in what is happening at their county level, that their ballot is going to be counted as they intended. That's an extremely important way in which we have trust in democracy. So I'm going to give you an example from my local context here. So here in St. Louis, this week, there are four monkeys running around St. Louis. And it started popping up on social media. Hey, there are four monkeys running around North St. Louis. And at first, people were like, is this true? Is this not true? And the reason that we know it's true is actually we have a documented report from a police officer who saw the monkeys running around. And there's been this call for public help. Let's figure out where these four monkeys are. And the city has not yet been able to find the monkeys. And this is because one of the ways in which it turns out that the city relies upon the public to help them identify this kind of problem is they say, send us the video if you see the monkeys so we can help figure out where they are. And people keep creating and generating these fake AI videos of monkeys. So it turns out the monkeys are smoking next to famous, things. They're running up and down the arch. They're going to the St. Louis Art Museum. They're going to Forest Park. These ones we are pretty sure are not true. But there are other people who are just making videos for fun. One of my colleagues made a picture of the four monkeys on the WashU campus, for example. So, people, they think it's funny. But what happens then at the city level is the officials who would usually be able to successfully seek the public's help in finding the monkeys, they have no idea where these monkeys are because they're completely bombarded by fake media. And so it's really hard for the county officials right now or the city officials to sort out what is true.
Mhm.
And they're just stuck. Now, monkeys are not a catastrophe, but I think this illustrates the kind of problem that can happen in real time. This could happen in an election too, and it could happen in a really bad way. So it could be the case that, bad actors could actually start to win and travel in this space of like, where you're supposed to go to vote. Do you have
Mhm.
to pay to vote? Is there no parking? Was there an accident? Like there's a lot of ways in which fiction can all of a sudden get elevated. And we just don't have the right set of plans yet to intervene and be safe. And I think trying to think about the technology that we need to be able to deploy and how we can rely upon that technology is really hard. Um, I think this interaction between the cheapness with which fiction can be produced, which is basically what AI can do, and social media, it's really hard to understand what is just a fun public craze about fake monkeys, where there actually are real monkeys somewhere out there, and things that could go wrong. And so I think we really need to think of a way in which we can build technology to provide tools in the background that officials could use and deploy if they need them.
Mhm.
And so we hope that we never have the kind of disaster that these tabletop games are designed for, but we should be ready just in case. And I
Mhm.
think we always hope that it's nothing more serious, and that the next conference that we have about this, we're still talking about affordability and the price of eggs, and we're not talking about, another election like the year 2000. But we need to be ready. And I think we should really, as a academic community in partnership with these election officials, being trying to think about like, we should start with tabletop games, but then we actually need to establish measured technological solutions with reliable partners that we can deploy.
Mhm. Well, one of the things that why I was thrilled about this year, or excuse me, last year in 2025 is, again, I you can see I've got the gray hair, and there's a lot more here. I tend to mask it, just mea culpa on that one. But I've been around this area for a long time. I've been working with the Voting Technology Project since 2000. That's again that's our part of our origin story. And over the years, we've all been trying really hard to build collaborations, to build partnerships, to work directly with election officials. And it's been a difficult process. There have been kind of fits and starts along the way. But I thought that, our events and some of the other election science events that happened in 2025 demonstrate that I think we've turned a corner in some sense on this problem. And like in October, there was just so much energy and enthusiasm and conversation between the research community and election officials in particular, just talking about problems and sharing concerns and sharing, hopes and goals and expectations for the future, especially about building additional collaborations and partnerships. After what we've done this year, what do you think we need to do to continue these conversations and to build off the foundation and build off this energy to continue to improve the administration of election in the US, but also to continue to improve the science that we do to support that?
I mean, one of the things that I take away from that first January meeting, that continued, I agree, through October, was the volume of interest in what I think of as translational work. The ability to take a research paper, which typically has an academic introduction that references other academic papers and some kind of complicated statistical model, and take that into a soundbite, if you will,
Mhm.
that an election official can then use and understand. And I just think the space for that is enormous. It also goes the other way. So the thing that, for example, you and I have both said, sitting in the meeting in October, as we started talking about, for example, how cool it is that we can use RAG-based solutions to build chatbots to boost trust in democracy. And there's general concern about deploying AI technology in chatbots,
Mhm.
was that we actually need more channels to understand each other. And the price of misunderstanding is really the price of not being prepared for the next election disaster. So I think this community that has been established since the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project started is enormously valuable, both for the academic community, so we're doing work on the problems that really matter, but also vice versa, to us to be able to share back trustworthy solutions. And I think this is a space where these research collaborations are just so important. So, I think if I had a wish, apart from my tabletop game wish, um, after these two conferences, like I'm going to have a chance to really continue to work with some of these public officials. So, if you are listening to this podcast, and you're interested in a research collaboration with Mike and I, like please reach out. Like I am interested in learning about what we can do together, whether that's just a phone call or it's actually like working on a research project to establish some kind of benchmark. I just think there's tremendous capacity in the research community to evaluate tools and to vet solutions and to share insights. And this is because the research community is not selling a product. So at the end of the day, we are really unbiased evaluators. And that's something that's a really important voice in this space. It's not only that we are not invested in a particular political outcome, but we're not invested in a particular technological solution either. And so we only have one priority, and that's to figure out what is true. And I think that is just a really important clear North Star for where we can provide meaningful value to the space. It's also the case that we're committed to, public scholarship, and we provide our research findings to a broad array of readers. We publish in avenues that then anyone can read regardless of their affiliation as well, and that gives us a way to share out things that are true. We heard a lot of concerns from some of the smaller counties in particular that they would be susceptible to some kind of vendor capture. So if they worked with a particular company, if they worked with a particular supplier, they could be captured by a vendor and lose some of their autonomy. And I think that is a really important thing to recognize is like these are people who are trying to use the tax dollars for their counties as efficiently as they can, and they want to be really thoughtful about making sure that they are delivering the best product. And so this is another place where I think academic collaborations are extremely important, is to try to evaluate the pathways for some of these solutions or where there can be collaborations. There are other kinds of organizations, I think especially those that are involved in the leadership around state legislatures, that can also lean in and do this kind of work. And so I think thinking about different kinds of actors in this space where we have lost some of the federal leadership in this space, to think about where those new collaborations can be is really important. So I think, to your question, after being one of the original founders of the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project, you've had a long career here of convening academics and election officials on projects. How can we continue to involve these election technology companies, their representatives? It was a really great way to have the technologists involved. Especially there are not that many rooms where they are also involved with election officials and academic researchers and technology providers, all in the same space. So how do we keep going to do that?
Well, I think it's a similar challenge, right, to the one about building collaborations with election officials from an academic perspective, but it's got different types of hurdles. One important hurdle that we always run into with respect to working with industry is that, as you said, they're working to make money. And as part of making money, they have to be very concerned about their intellectual property. And doing research directly with industry partners, starts to raise these questions about intellectual property rights. But you know what? Those are things our universities, yours and mine, we have people who deal with this all the time, right? And I hear this kind of concern, and I'm like, okay, you know what? We can deal with that. So, what I think we really need is something like what you just said, which is that, again, I know right now, because I can see the list of people who are participating. There's some election technologists who are listening to us right as we're talking live. Many others are going to hear this as they watch it on YouTube or as they're listening to it on Spotify. I would love it if we can figure out a way to just spark a few trial partnerships with some in industry so that we can demonstrate to the election technology industry in general that we can work together in productive and collaborative ways that don't, violate any of their intellectual property concerns, that, can lead to research that's productive for us and research that's productive for them, and research that ultimately improves the conduct of election administration in the US. So some of you are out there listening. If you've got a research problem in particular, if it relates to some of the AI things that we're working on, but anything in general, our coordinates, right? Reach out to us. And if it's not something that we specifically can work on, we'll find some academic partners for you to work with. And I just think we really need to just keep saying that. But we importantly, I think, need to find some trial projects where we can actually demonstrate how productive those collaborations can be in this area like they are in the many other areas where WashU and Caltech collaborate directly with industry. I also think we need to continue what we're doing right now, which is have these events and bring those folks to the table. And I think one thing that's in the back of my mind is that perhaps we should have a very specific meeting at some point with folks from the election technology industry and really focus the light on the problems that they have and on the ways in which we can work together to build technology solutions. Now, okay, we've been going for almost an hour, and I know you have a day job to get back to. So, but before we sign off, I wanted to just tell folks that today it's the 14th of January. Next week on January 22nd, we're going to be issuing a short summary report about the two conferences. That's going to have the agendas, links to all the slide decks, video links, and overviews of the events. There's also going to be an article in Election Line Weekly. For those of you who read Election Line, you all should be reading Election Line. So if you're not, please subscribe, but get access to it. An article that's going to come out on the 22nd where it's going to have links to all these materials as well. So be on the lookout for that. And anything else we should discuss, Betsy, before we sign off?
I mean, I think the last thing I want to ask is like, when and where are we going to host our next AI-related elections conference?
Okay, great question. That's that I have to answer that. I'm right now on sabbatical leave, so it's like, okay, not me, not me. No, I honestly think serious answer is as soon as we can. I know we're talking about this right now, and folks will stay tuned. But I hope that maybe late summer or early fall we'll have another convening, whether it's at WashU or back here at Caltech or somewhere else. I don't know, but we're committed to continuing this conversation, and so stay tuned for that.
Okay, great.
Okay, well, Betsy, I just want to thank you for not only taking the time today, but for this partnership with you, over the last year. I know we've been collaborating for ages, but this having you and your team and your expertise and your energy and your intellectual input has just made this not only just a thousand times better as a project, but it's made it so much fun because it's just great fun working with you all and the folks at WashU. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
And we're going to keep it going. So,
Keep it going.
well, with that, I want to thank folks who tuned in. And again, thank you again, Betsy. Take care.
Bye.